I am a new nonprofit established in December 2022, and I'm beginning the process of applying for grants. Could you recommend a range of services that could help with fundraising, maintaining compliance, and maximizing our organization's potential?
Maybe. So I think what the question sort of feels like to me is that you've started a new nonprofit, which basically you had a really good idea and I want to do this thing that's going to help people in some way. And I've got this mission and I may be starting to do some programs and like the fun stuff. And now all of a sudden you're like, oh no, how do I get money? Right. So the next step for a lot of baby nonprofits that are not super well versed in this universe is I'm just going to start asking for grants. I'm going to start applying for grants, which is hard, especially if you don't have the infrastructure, which the question is like, what's the infrastructure for managing an organization? I would say, and maybe it's because Stacey asked me and I didn't ask Stacey, like the way the question asking worked this time, I would say that you're probably not prepared at all. That this is the hard work of running a business. Like you picked, like no joke, you picked the hardest kind of business to just start. Nonprofits are not easy. They're not like, oh, I don't really feel like doing it, very much. And this is something that I just want to do in my spare time. So maybe I'll start a nonprofit. That's like a really good way to it's like buying a boat, right? like the joke about buying it's like, if you want to have the experience of owning a boat, you stand in the shower and light $100 bills on fire. It's like the same kind of thing for like a nonprofit, right? Is you let's see, what do? You stare at Excel for hours and hours and hours, and then get a job working at Target. Like that's that's kind of the experience of starting up a nonprofit. So it's really, really a difficult thing that you've undertaken, and as you've noticed that there's all this extra work that you have to do. So we joke all the time, like there's no for-profit business in the world that's got annual revenues of $1 million that does a strategic plan or has to have audited financial statements. Like you just don't have to do that. It's so much easier to sell stuff on Etsy or drive Uber or open up a dry cleaners or all the other sort of like quick business ideas that you might think of. Like that's 1,000 times easier than starting up a new nonprofit from scratch, which comes with like infinitely more regulations than another kind of organization. So my recommendation would be go find the friendly people at SCORE. I know we've had folks from SCORE on the podcast a really, really long time ago. But they have folks that work there they're volunteers and they're business leaders. They're people that have done business stuff for years and years and years, and then they retire, a lot of them, and then say, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to help new business owners come up with ideas. And they do have people that are really well versed in like starting up nonprofit stuff that can help you with all of the compliance and planning, sort of wrapping your head around like, I've got this great idea. What do I do next? Because the answer isn't go get grants, right? The answer is a whole bunch of other stuff before you can even get to the go get grant stage. So I'd reach out to SCORE. We'll put a link in the show notes to where you can find your local SCORE affiliate. I've found them, anybody I've ever interacted with at SCORE has always been like really helpful and really friendly. So I wouldn't feel bad about saying, help, I don't know what I'm doing in this case. What do you think, Stacey?
Yeah, I think SCORE is a great resource. I think there are some other resources when you use the power of, the magic of the internet. There's a lot that, there's some good ones through Candid, that candid.org offers sort of some, live, like you're just getting started. Here's what you need to know. So I think, the first stage is the education piece. I am glad though, like in the question you ask about what services could help you, right? Because it is going to take, I think that's premature until you figure out kind of your roadmap and your plan moving forward and get some education around it. But, and you don't probably need to hire services yet till you start actually doing a little bit of work. But I do think knowing that this is complex, so you are probably at some point going to need fundraising services, compliance services, whether it's you or your organization. So good for you for like realizing that that you are going to need that. And yeah, I would totally say hold tight. Do not spend one other second on a grant right now. Please promise me you'll do that, because it just isn't gonna, it's gonna be a waste of your time at this stage in the game. You're too young, you're too new. And generally, like speaking, you don't have enough like proof, return of what your programs are doing, and you just don't have enough skin in the game and time in the game for you to even be remotely competitive. So I think getting the house in order first is really good advice from Andy. And yeah, I think Score and Candid, but also like look around, because there's a ton of resources out there that kind of have like boot camp for beginning startup nonprofits and like organizations that actually provide that support. And so Score and Candid are two of them. But absolutely like lean on that. And then, and good luck to you. I mean, you can also ask if you, depending on what community you're coming from, sometimes your local United Ways, sometimes your local community foundation, sometimes at your university, there might be like introductory, like intro to nonprofit type, classes, workshops, things to help you kind of get the groundwork laid. So look into all those resources available. A lot of them are, low cost or no cost. So that's also a perk.
Nonprofit governance.
Nonprofit answers.
Nonprofit board. Nonprofit management.
Nonprofit marketing. Nonprofit resources.
Welcome to Nonprofit Everything, the podcast where hosts Andy Shurick and Stacey Wedding answer your questions about all things nonprofit.
Welcome to another episode of Nonprofit Everything. I'm Andy Shurick. I'm here with my friend Stacey Wedding, and we're here just to answer questions about nonprofit stuff. So the way it works is you email us your questions to questions@nonprofiteverything.com, or you can head to nonprofiteverything.com, which is the homepage for the show, where we've got show notes and resources and all kinds of other good stuff. And there's a button on that page that says Ask a Question. You can click that question, and that'll get the question to us as well. Recently, we've gotten a couple of emails thanking us for answering really basic nonprofit questions, something that they found that other nonprofit podcasts didn't do quite as often. And I'll tell you, Stacey and I think this is fantastic. We, as much as we love getting trapped and deep in the weeds by a really arcane section of nonprofit rules, we also really like talking about the really basic stuff, the stuff that you would need to know when you're coming into the sector for the first time. So if you have questions and you're just listening to the podcast to kind of get some ideas about the sector, do not be afraid to send us an email that says, I don't understand why I would even want a nonprofit, or I still don't think I understand this whole tax deductibility thing. Can you explain it again? Like anything you want to know, Stacey and I will be delighted to go deep into the weeds and explain how everything works. So, and for those of us that have been around for a while, it's number one, it's a good refresher. And number two, things have changed. The stuff that we learned starting in this, 30 something years ago, 35 years ago, when I started doing nonprofit stuff, things are very different now. So even we old dogs can learn new tricks every once in a while as well. So thanks for listening. And with that, we will jump right in.
We are looking to hire our first development director, but have a limited budget, so we'll probably hire someone part-time. We heard that working on commission is not recommended or considered appropriate. Since we don't have many funds, would you recommend we hire someone for a campaign or event and then hope enough is raised to bring them on in a more permanent role, even if it's just part-time? And what is the best route for finding a good development person?
There's a lot of questions.
That is a lot.
It's a lot at once.
Woo!
So
let's maybe.
Yeah. I'll probably tackle the easiest one first and then pitch to Stacey. So it's not that working on commission isn't recommended. It's that it's against the AFP Code of Ethics. So the AFP is the Association of Fundraising Professionals. It's like the sort of preeminent organization for development people. And one of the things that they've decided sort of as an organization is that when you're asking for money for an organization, you want to be asking for money for the organization and not like trying to line your pockets and make the ask bigger, because that means you get a bigger commission. It just seems kind of gross and just isn't appropriate at all. So that's why we don't ever recommend having a development person on commission. However, like just by employing someone, like then you're giving them money to do the job, right? So that's kind of sounds like that's part of the issue here, is that you're in this weird area where there's not necessarily enough money to hire a person, but you need the money, so you need that person to go out and get the money. And I will say from years of experience, like it's a really hard sell to get somebody who's good at their job and then telling them, by the way, like you have to raise enough money for your own salary. Like that's most development people will not accept a job under those terms unless they're really desperate or really green. Or think your organization is the most cool thing in the whole universe and they're willing to do it for free anyway. So those are kind of the only scenarios where you're going to find somebody that's going to say like, yeah, we want to hire you full time, but we can't. So you have to raise this amount of money. So you're basically paying your own salary. So it's a really hard thing to do. What do you think, Stacey? I told you I'd pitch it back to you.
Yeah. I do. I think nonprofits are guilty of this a lot, and I get why, right? Like you don't have the money, but I also think you're not only you're not going to be able to recruit someone based on, yes, you have to raise your own salary, or we only have 3 months or 6 months. You have 6 months of your salary covered. Like I don't think that is that doesn't feel sustainable. That doesn't feel comfortable. And that's a lot of pressure, because anyone who knows the first thing about fundraising knows there are a lot of components to it, right? Like, this isn't just selling widgets, right? This is, okay, what kind of database do we have? Let's assess what we've done before and what's working. Let's create a plan. Let's build relationships, which don't happen overnight. So we're not just always, reaching out to someone, communicating with them with just like our handout. And so all this takes time. And so I get nervous when I hear questions like this, because I go, it's not about like, okay, just bring them in for one campaign or one small blip like event, because I go like, there's a whole lot, like looking at it more holistically. I think you're going to, you can get someone who might make some money for you doing it, but like, it's not probably going to be enough in most cases to actually cover their salary. And it's not even fair to measure it on that, because it's a process. So I just go, you've got to invest in like the board, the, CEO, executive director needs to invest, like figure out how you put some money aside and have at least one full year salary. Like, I don't even think you should be having this conversation until you can do that. I just don't. I think that sure, you can maybe, again, like some workarounds are maybe you have someone who will come in to help you raise some money. Maybe the short-term answer is bring in someone who can do more like a short-term event or like campaign to start to give you the extra money that you can then hire like full time. But I don't think it's fair. Like, and I don't think it's actually going to do your organization any, I think it's going to do you a disservice. So you think that's pretty hardcore, Andy, saying a year's salary? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm a math person, right? So I think if there's not a plan in place about who we're going to ask, how much money we think we can get, what the likelihood of that gift is, like all of the pre-work that you need to do to determine how much revenue you're going to bring in, that's a super important job. And it sounds like and I don't want to, first of all, thank you for asking the question. We appreciate that you're doing this. We're glad that you're growing enough to bring somebody in. And if you're serious about making this last for a long time, there's tons of pre-work that you can do without having a development person on board that will give you information about what revenue is coming in over what period of time, which will then make you much more comfortable about, okay, if we do these things and we get to this point, we will have enough money so that we can hire a development person forever. Like this person will then be permanent, right? Because we know we've got enough stuff rolling and coming in the pipeline and coming in that we'll be able to fund that salary. So it starts as a list of like, here are all the places we're going to get our money. Here's how much we think we're going to ask for. Here's who's responsible for it. This is the likelihood of getting that gift. This is when we think it's going to come in. And then you sort of build this revenue plan that says, here's how this is going to work. And then you'll look at the revenue plan and you're just going to say like, wow, this is never going to do what we want it to do. We don't have enough energy to do this. So we're going to have to like really put the thumb screws to our board to have them help us come up with a nest egg to be able to kickstart the process. Or you're going to look at it and it's going to say, oh, wow, look at that. Like if we actually do these things, we can hire somebody in September and then we won't have to worry about bringing them on part-time or trying to like come up with some magic gala event that's going to fund us for the next year because we've got the whole thing like sort of planned out on paper first. So that's what I would do. I would spend some of this energy that you've got in your organization now on like putting the revenue plan together and thinking really deeply about it, which will then give you the information you need about when to hire somebody.
And I also want to caution or provide some advice on a couple other things. You are always, if you're an executive director, no development person or professional will ever be successful without a close partnership with their executive director, period, end of story. So, I mean, nothing kills fundraising success, quicker than not having an executive director who is not only understands it and understands fundraising, but also and understands that it doesn't just happen quickly, but also is your partner in it, right? Helps introduce you to some of the existing donors and to board members, and works closely with you on helping execute the fundraising plan, because sometimes your executive director should be a part of larger conversations with larger donors, because the donors will expect it or require it, right? So I also think, like, thinking about a person who wrote this, thinking about realizing it's not going to just be, let me hand this off, someone's going to go do all that work, because that we see that philosophy a lot. Like, good, I don't have to do it anymore. And it's like, well, no, like you're still going to have to do it. Hopefully it'll be a little more strategic, right? And higher end or higher level. And I think the other thing is thinking about, and I think your revenue plan, Andy, idea will help with this, but like, are you truly leaving money on the table? So how many times do you talk to an organization that says, oh, we need a development person? And it's just because they know everyone else has a development person, and they haven't actually thought about, like, do we really, like, is there money? Are there asks not being made? Is there work not getting done? Is there money being left on the table that we just don't have capacity or time for? If the answer is yes, then great. Like, obviously, you absolutely need to do this. But so many times it's just because people think that's what you're, quote, supposed to do. And I just think, like, being real, it's like, are you really, or are you doing fine? And like, you just are thinking everyone else has one, so that means you need one. And then why does it have to be a development director? So that, like, that's the other question I would ask is, if this is your first time development hire, I just think that revenue plan, to your point, Andy, will help answer what is it you really need. Like, do you need boots on the ground, like more of a development coordinator or development manager that's more like providing some of the back end administrative support, doing, dating the database, doing the nice little thank you notes, or helping do the research on a donor for you? Like, what is it? Because a director is going to require more money than someone that's like a more entry level or mid-level development professional. So thinking about that too, I think might be helpful.
Yeah. And like, I think that's a really good point, is that maybe the development director position isn't the position that you need. I would also say that as your organization grows, so the role, we've talked about this a lot, you sound like you're kind of in this adolescence phase now, which is, congratulations, you've survived your teenage years. And now it gets a lot harder, because you've got the role that you made for yourself at the beginning was like, we're going to get this thing started and I'm going to think about operations and strategy and all this fun stuff. And the reason you hire development directors, because you're trying to say, okay, I don't really want to do all the fundraising work. I want to like give that responsibility to somebody new who's going to magically make money appear. Right. But that's actually not what happens. Is the bigger you get, the more the executive position goes from being operations and strategy and planning, and it gets moved to where most of your time is spent doing strategy, governance, and fundraising. So you get no operations stuff. Like, that stuff all gets moved to staff that knows how to do that, freeing up your time to do the one thing that you're trying to hire somebody for, which is fundraising. So you're the chief development officer right now. You're the development director right now. So you need to give yourself those responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know what you're supposed to do, if like, well, I just thought of this thing, if this is a founder question, well, I just made this thing and I don't really know what to do next. And I know you're supposed to have a development director. Like, maybe this is a good time to like engage with AFP and say like, hey, I've got this organization. We're growing and I don't really feel like I necessarily know what I'm supposed to be doing in this development role. maybe you guys can help me figure out what I'm supposed to do and get some of that on board. Because what you're going to discover is it's a lot of stuff you're already doing. It's making relationships. It's coming up with good volunteer activities so that you can get people engaged with your mission. Like there's all kinds of other things that aren't just like, cold calling rich old ladies who spend all their money on cat food and you're like, want to take some of their cat food budget away. Right. So it's a totally different, it might be a different world than you think it is. And you're probably doing a lot of it already. Okay, Stacey, this one starts with your name. So I'm asking you, what are the benefits and risks of a staff member serving as a board member, especially on the executive committee? The question then goes on to talk about specific bylaws, and one of the section on bylaws, which it describes the president. And this is I'll ask you more questions about this one because I'm always confused about this one, which they've named one of the officers president and then said that the president should be the chief executive and operating officer of the corporation. And then goes on to ask, like, if the organization only has a staff of 2, like, does that even make sense? So what do you think?
Ooh, let's unpack this a little. Okay, so first and foremost, I'm just going to share that when you look at kind of leading practices for the most part, particularly coming from my bias is I am certified by BoardSource, and BoardSource is kind of that national hub for all things nonprofit board related and research done and years of experience, right? So I do want to put that bias out there. But BoardSource, one of their founding kind of leading practice principles is just that, you can have a nonprofit executive director be a non-voting or a couple, they don't get into other staff. But let's just say, for example, you have a couple staff that you want to be on the board. They're but they should be non-voting members, right? Your chief executive, if you've got, someone who wants to be on the board, can be on the board, but is a non-voting member of the board. So they still absolutely have a seat at the table, can influence discussion, can really play a role, like a peer-based role, but there isn't the potential blurred lines between oversight and execution that can happen when you actually have staff on the board as well, right? Your paid staff board is a volunteer board, and so there's a lot of sort of conflict, duality of loyalty and conflict of interest issues that can arise, and so accountability, annual evaluations. So it's not that it's not. So the benefit, the risk is just, I think you risk blurring that line, and you risk blurring just it being messy and people not necessarily adhering unless you have a really in-depth conflict of interest policy that outlines how you deal with someone if they are a paid staff member on your board. That's the way around it. It's not it's illegal for staff to serve on boards. Now, there are some states, I believe California is one of them, right, that limits the number or percentage of paid staff that can serve on a board. So that's something to keep in mind. You should look at your state statutes on that. But it's just, I will tell you, in general, you find it to be fairly unusual with typical public charity organizations to see paid staff on the board because of that conflict and that blurred line. There's also, and Andy, you'll know this probably better than me, right? But there's a new question on the Form 990 that specifically asks about the number of directors who are not, quote, independent on your board because they have an economic relationship with the organization. And so that would, there is scrutiny on that. So then you would have to say, well, we have two board members or however many board members that are basically getting paid. They're paid staff, so they're not independent. So this is obviously important enough that there's a question on the Form 990, right? There's a lot of practice and research out there that says be really careful, which is why it's yeah, you can have a seat and voice because, in a board meeting, in executives or staff's deliberation can be instrumental. Invaluable for informing decision making. So there is I love the idea of staff, particularly I would limit it to, the top the top staff member or the top couple of staff people being on the board, but like not being voting board members. So you kind of keep this cleaner. But then like, let's talk about this, because I know when we talk nonprofit, we know there's different types of nonprofits. It's also like, let's talk about another circumstance, which is probably not what this question's about, but like you look at a private foundation, right? In a private foundation, which again is a nonprofit structure, you oftentimes see, right? Like the foundations, the entire, at least the board chair is also like the person that's getting paid and is like the paid staff position. So I think that like the long and short is it's one of those like questions that it's like, it depends on the type of nonprofit. It depends on the structure. It depends on the organization. But in general, I think there is more risk to it. The benefit, again, you can achieve the benefit without having a voting seat. So like that in a nutshell is what I would say. And executive committee just takes it up a notch, right? Executive committee tends to be officers, for those who are listening who may not be aware of that, right? In general, an executive committee are the officers, the elected officers, the treasurer, secretary, chairman, vice chair, right? Positions. And sometimes there's others that also serve on an executive committee. But so that just adds a whole other layer of like power control. So, from a staff angle, like, yeah, people would love it if staff would love it if they could just be like, let me also be the board. So like we have full power and control, right? Let's be honest, Andy. You and I have both worked at nonprofits. There's times it's like, dang, I'd make a lot better decision than this board did.
So in as part of the question, like they listed one of the pieces of the bylaws where they talked about the board officer position called president, and then gave the requirements of the president is that they'll preside, which is, I think, what the word means, right, at the board meetings. So does that mean that if the CEO is the president, they're also the board chair? Or is there a difference between president and board chair? It sounds like you have to maybe write the bylaws clear enough that you're delineating between the over the top title that we gave the executive director. We called them the president and CEO because that's what's on their employment contract, because that's what they wanted. And then the responsibility of a board chair, which is different, because I don't know that you ever want your executive director to be your board chair. That doesn't seem like that's a recipe for disaster, right?
Total recipe. And yeah, and when the question was written and sort of that bylaw provision was just, what I would love to know, it's hard because, I want to see the full bylaws, but I also think like oftentimes, like I've seen bylaws where you have like the president and a chairman, you have two different, like here's the president, and that is, the chief paid executive of our organization, and here's their role. But usually the language is different in there, right? It's usually works at the service of the board. There's some similarities, but it's not, they wouldn't like be presiding over necessarily the board meetings. So this feels like a bylaws issue. Like that just feels weird to me, that clause. Like it feels like someone may have like ripped off someone else's bylaws or a corporate bylaws and gotten confused, because you see that happen a lot. And so like, but in general, and you'll also see organizations like that have a chairman, and like they'll talk about chairman and president they exchange those two terms, right? Like they're interchangeable. So and a lot of times I've had organizations who I've worked with who have said like the reason why is because, Secretary of State has their little annual list of officer form and it says president. And so, right. So back to these forms and policies and stuff. So because of that, they feel the need to put this word president in there, but because of it, it confuses everyone. I am a huge believer that it should be, to keep it clear. You could put something in your bylaws that says chairman, also may be referred to as like president, so those two are interchangeable. If there's confusion, or that you just are really clear, like the chairman is the same thing as the president for the sake of filling out that stupid form, right? The annual form. And then, and the chief executive is something like paid executive is something different than that. Like it shouldn't be one and the same for all I know we've had other podcast episodes about this too, right? Like that someone could pull up, but then it's like, oh my gosh, talk about what I just said and then magnify it. Okay, you get to be in charge of, making decisions on whether you get hired and fired. You're the board chair, so you get to decide, right? Like you get to sort of run the decisions on what your compensation is each year. Anyway, it's just crazy. Like it's nonsense. It makes no sense. But anyway, I don't know if that answered, did that answer? I feel like I'm talking in circles here, but the point is I think those bylaws need some tweaking. Like there's it in the nutshell. I need to be clear on roles because it makes no sense.
Yeah. It seems like bylaws is just one of those things that, like when you're first starting the organization, you're doing the 1023 and you need bylaws and you're like, we'll just download something from the internet, right? And you just like pull in whatever, you Google nonprofit bylaws and you do that and you make a couple of tweaks and then you never look at them again, like not realizing that that's like the operating instructions for your board and that, and part of it is that like it never really becomes an issue. Like unless your organization comes apart, nobody ever really goes back to the bylaws and says, well, you've been in violation of 90% of your bylaws because you downloaded something from the internet and didn't actually read it. But there's something about like trying to, at least for me, like I'm not an attorney and I have great respect for people who can do that because I don't have the brain that allows me to like look at language and like think, well, what this really could possibly mean is, right? But like for me, looking at bylaws and trying to figure out like what the scenario is, it's just like I feel like I just got dumped into a super deep hole. I'm like, I don't even know what words mean anymore. Like, like I see the word the and what is the? Like, why are we using the, right? So it might be useful to get some help from someone who does know bylaws. Like at one of my previous jobs, we had an attorney who was a super nice guy who was really good at like reading bylaws and being able to clarify them and say, take all this out. You don't need it. This is not necessary. Like he knew the law. He knew how it worked in the state we were in. And he was just super great at being able to make it really clear and obvious. So it might be helpful to find somebody like that's willing to work with you and to get the bylaws cleaned up rather than just using something you downloaded.
And the caveat to what Andy just said, though, is promise me it's an attorney who understands nonprofit and understands nonprofit law. Like there are so many bylaws I've seen that have been written by attorneys that didn't understand the nuance or the difference, and they're poorly written. They're just not applicable to nonprofit. So make sure you get to Andy's point, but make sure that person's vetted. Like they understand nonprofits, they understand how it should be written, they understand, like your state law and what does or doesn't need to happen. But no, I would steer away from don't ever have any staff be on the be in the executive, like be an officer, like a board officer position. I mean, if it's some people would even say like there's certain like nonprofit structures, even like you think about a really large hospital system or like multi-unit hospital system, maybe there's some sort of structure in a really large institution where having a seat on the board makes more sense. And so again, I don't want to say it's a hard and fast rule in general. I think unless you're a pretty complex nonprofit, keep the lines clear and just have a non-voting seat on the board.
Thanks for joining us today. Stacey and I really appreciate that you've taken the time out of your busy schedule, especially if you're a nonprofit professional, to listen to the podcast. We love the questions. We thrive on the feedback. Please keep it coming. We really read absolutely everything you send to us, and we will answer every question we get, whether we've gotten it before or not. So send us anything. I think we answered a question about how to get the cat pee smell out of carpet once. We'd prefer them to be nonprofit questions, but to be honest, we'll answer pretty much anything. So send this in to us and we will get them on. And send your question in, and who knows, maybe you will hear it again when we join you again in 2 weeks.